Karoline Leavitt had gotten used to the silence. In the hallways of D.C., people saw her coming and politely looked away, too afraid to say what they really thought. But this morning, she wasn't met with silence. She was met with smirks, the kind of smirks that tell you something's coming, something mean. She didn't know about the email yet. It had started as whispers around Capitol Hill, staffers nudging each other, phones passed under desks, a few stifled laughs in committee waiting rooms. But it only took hours before the leak exploded across social media. A chain of internal emails from within the Senate Judiciary Committee, written months earlier during Karoline's rise, had surfaced. The subject line, "Leavitt, no real future." The body of the emails was worse. "This girl has no substance," one line read. "She's a TikTok politician. Give her 2 months," another added. But the most devastating words came from someone at the very top. "She'll never make it past February. Trust me, Elizabeth Warren." It wasn't just some bitter staffer. It was the progressive icon herself. Karoline was stunned. Not because she hadn't faced criticism before, she had, but because this wasn't just political strategy. This was personal. This was them betting on her failure, them laughing while they wrote her off. By noon, every network was talking about it. MSNBC had a segment titled, "Too Far, Too Fast." CNN ran a poll. Should Karoline resign? But Karoline wasn't retreating. She printed the emails, every page. She placed them into a single black folder, tucked it into her bag, straightened her blazer, and walked directly toward the cameras. She didn't call her staff. She didn't prepare remarks. She just walked. And as she did, something inside her clicked. Not fear, not anger. Something colder. Conviction. If they were going to write her out of the story, then she was going to write herself back in. And this time, she'd read their words, not whisper hers. The Capitol press area had seen plenty of prepared statements and tightly choreographed pressers. What it hadn't seen, at least not in recent memory, was a 29-year-old walking in without a teleprompter, without aides, without a plan. Karoline Leavitt didn't want polish. She wanted truth. The cameras whirred as she approached. Microphones turned like flowers toward the sun, hunting sound. A Fox producer whispered, "She looks furious." A CNN reporter grinned. "This is gonna be good." Karoline took the mic. "I'm not here to deny anything," she said. "I'm here to confirm it." There was a moment of stillness. Journalists puzzled, caught off guard. She reached into her bag, pulled out the black folder, and held it up. "This," she said, "is what they think of you when they think no one's watching. When you don't look like them. When you weren't born into it. When you weren't supposed to be here." Then she opened it. "I'll start with the last one. From Elizabeth Warren herself." She read it slowly, letting the words hang. "She'll never make it past February. Trust me. Elizabeth." The room shifted. The oxygen changed. You could feel it, that electric crackle when power slips from the hands of the elite and into someone else's grip. One MSNBC reporter looked physically uncomfortable. Another took a long, deep breath. "I wasn't supposed to see this," Karoline said. "You weren't either. But now that we have, what do we do with it?" She let that hang too. They expected her to rage, to cry, to crumble. But what they got was command. Each word she read wasn't just an exposure. It was an indictment. A mirror held up to a political class that cloaked exclusion in smiles and backhanded compliments. She turned a page. "She's a TikTok politician." Her eyes locked onto the CNN camera. "Is that your problem? That I know how to speak to people under 40? That I'm not afraid to explain policy in a way people actually understand?" She turned another page. "She has no substance." She looked straight ahead. "I've drafted legislation. I've sat through hearings. I've built coalitions while you typed punchlines. If that's no substance, then maybe the problem is your definition." This wasn't a meltdown. It was a reckoning. Karoline didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Because what echoed through the room wasn't volume, it was truth. And for the first time, the media didn't interrupt. They let her finish. Because deep down, even they knew this wasn't just a girl reading emails, this was a woman rewriting the narrative. As Karoline closed the folder, the air in the Capitol media room had turned so dense you could almost feel it pressing against your skin. She didn't smirk. She didn't grandstand. She simply let the silence say what 1,000 viral sound bites never could. No one spoke, not the seasoned anchors, not the bitter Twitter journalists, not even the press secretaries behind the scenes watching from their phones, because they knew. If they said anything now, anything, it would only make it worse, because she hadn't lied. She hadn't twisted the facts. She had read their words, verbatim, and in doing so, she'd held up a mirror. Not just to Elizabeth Warren, not just to the media class, but to everyone who had ever sat in a private room and chuckled, "She won't last." The emails were real. The arrogance was real. And now the cost was real too. Karoline stepped back from the mic, just as the first reporter gathered the courage to speak. "Congresswoman Leavitt," he asked cautiously, "do you think this will backfire?" That going public with internal correspondence might be seen as unprofessional, or even desperate. She looked at him with the kind of clarity that cuts. "Desperate would be letting people believe this is normal," she said. "Desperate is pretending these aren't the same people who talk about elevating women's voices while silencing the ones they don't like. What I did today isn't desperate. It's American." Flashbulbs popped. The narrative had already begun to fracture. Across the nation, cable news producers scrambled. "Change the headline," one MSNBC assistant producer muttered into his headset. "Drop the unstable label. We need a new angle." At Harvard, a law student posted a clip with the caption, "Elizabeth Warren got outflanked by the girl she said wouldn't last." Within an hour, it had 1.4 million views. But inside the offices of Capitol Hill, where old alliances stitched themselves with decades of unspoken rules, something far more dangerous was brewing. Respect. Not admiration, not support. Respect, the kind that's reluctant, the kind that's whispered behind closed doors, the kind that starts with, "You saw what she did, right?" Karoline didn't walk out smiling. She walked out unchanged, because she hadn't come for validation. She had come for confrontation. And she'd gotten it, in full. By the time Karoline returned to her office, the storm she'd unleashed had already crossed oceans. News tickers ran her name alongside Warren's. Editorials scrambled to find a tone, not too supportive, not too dismissive. Comment sections lit up like brush fires. She read them like scripture. They underestimated the wrong one. But while the world outside buzzed, inside her office, it was quiet, almost eerily so. Her staff, young, loyal, bruised by months of ridicule, watched her with a mix of awe and disbelief. A junior aide whispered, "I think we just broke the internet." Karoline sat down, peeled off her blazer, and calmly poured a glass of water. "Let it break," she said, but she knew what came next. Elizabeth Warren wouldn't stay silent. The old guard never did. They would pivot, accuse her of taking things out of context, of playing the victim, of politicizing private exchanges. That was the playbook. She'd seen it too many times to count, and sure enough, it started. A statement dropped within an hour from Warren's office. "These emails represent internal discussions during a staffing review. Taking them public undermines the integrity of our institutions." Karoline read it, then read it again. Integrity. She almost laughed, but instead, she opened her laptop, pulled up the original email, and screenshotted the line that started it all. "She'll never make it past February. Trust me, Elizabeth." She posted it with just 4 words. No context needed. Truth hurts. It exploded. Commentators scrambled to pick sides. Some tried to reframe the moment as a media stunt. Others dug deeper. A few even admitted what none had dared say aloud before. Karoline had changed the rules. She hadn't gone around the system. She'd walked right into its heart and called it out by name. And perhaps most importantly, she hadn't done it for sympathy. She wasn't asking to be pitied. She wasn't demanding fairness. She was demanding accountability, and for once the people watching weren't distracted by outrage. They were captivated by clarity. Karoline wasn't playing their game. She was writing her own. By the following morning, Warren had escalated. She didn't just send out a press release. She appeared live on Morning Joe. Her tone was controlled, but the condescension wasn't subtle. "I think Representative Leavitt is confused," Warren said, tilting her head slightly. "We were having a conversation about candidate viability. That's a conversation we've all had. I've been underestimated too. It was classic Washington: diminish, then redirect. But Karoline didn't wait for the clip to settle. She cut it mid-air. On her own live stream, unfiltered, unedited, she paused Warren's segment and looked directly at the camera. "She's right," Karoline said. "She has been underestimated, and instead of breaking the cycle, she decided to become the one doing the underestimating." It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't even a formal rebuttal. It was raw, it was real, and it was relatable. "What I read wasn't political commentary," she continued. "It was personal dismissal. And if that's acceptable behind the scenes, then we should say it publicly. All of it. Out loud." Her feed surged. Comments rolled in by the thousands. This is what politics should be. They're not used to someone speaking without a filter. She didn't just clap back. She translated it. Back in Warren's circle, aides were scrambling. The plan had been to paint Karoline as reckless, too emotional, too ambitious, too young. But that narrative was already slipping. Because here was Karoline, not spiraling, but rising. She wasn't swearing. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't storming out. She was sitting calmly, dissecting the political doublespeak with surgical precision. It rattled them. Warren's second follow-up tweet, clearly rushed, didn't help. "We don't build unity by weaponizing private emails. We build it by focusing on policy." Karoline replied in under 30 seconds. "I agree. Let's start with your policy on gatekeeping." And just like that, the conversation flipped again. No longer was Karoline defending herself. Now Warren was the one on defense. Just as the Warren firestorm reached its peak, something unexpected happened. A hearing. House Committee on Oversight. Scheduled weeks earlier, it had nothing to do with emails or viral moments. The topic was election transparency. Karoline, of course, was on the panel. So was Elizabeth Warren. The room was packed. Not because the public suddenly cared about procedural ballots, but because this would be the first time the two women would be face-to-face since the email leak. Journalists perched like hawks. Staffers lined the walls, texting live updates. Even C-SPAN saw a ratings bump. Warren entered first, composed, clutching notes. She nodded to a few colleagues and avoided eye contact with Karoline's side of the chamber. Karoline entered seconds later, wearing navy. No notes, no handlers, just a thin, leather-bound copy of the Constitution tucked beneath her arm. When she took her seat, a hush fell. The chairman opened with standard remarks, but no one really heard him. Everyone was waiting for the moment the questions began, and whether the undertone of email scandal would spill into public testimony. It didn't take long. Warren spoke first. "I believe we need guardrails," she said, "to protect our electoral process from disinformation and from those who might misuse internal government materials for personal gain." A thinly veiled jab. Karoline's mic clicked on. "With respect," she said, her voice steady, "I believe what undermines trust more than anything is secrecy. I didn't misuse anything, I revealed the reality." A murmur swept through the room. She continued. "If reading a quote, word for word, from a sitting senator is now considered disinformation, then maybe our problem isn't the truth. Maybe it's the discomfort it causes." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words landed not like a bomb, but like a bell, clear, echoing, undeniable. And Warren? For the first time in the entire hearing, she didn't respond. She looked down, flipped a page. The silence was louder than any rebuttal. The room was no longer simply watching. It was hanging on her every word. Karoline had read the first two emails, and the entire panel, including aides who had until then been scrolling on their phones or whispering behind clipboards, were frozen. Elizabeth Warren sat upright now, her fingers locked in a white-knuckled grip on her seat's armrest. But Karoline wasn't finished, not even close. "This next one," she said, lifting the printed sheet as if it were a sealed indictment, "was sent just days after I declared my candidacy. The subject line reads, 'Contain her before it spreads.'" She let the words linger like smoke in the air. A murmur rippled across the chamber. She continued, "It says, and I quote, 'She's media-trained, dangerously composed. She knows how to weaponize civility. Don't debate her. Sideline her.'" Gasps. Audible gasps. It wasn't just the content. It was the phrasing. The words felt premeditated, strategic, insidious. This wasn't politics. This was institutional sabotage. Warren tried to cut in, her voice sharp. "You're cherry-picking context. These weren't—" Karoline turned to face her. Calm, controlled, devastating. "I'll gladly read the whole thread, Senator," she replied, "but it won't make you look better." The crowd behind them, staffers, interns, visiting journalists, had shifted from passive listeners to live witnesses in a political reckoning. Phones were discreetly raised. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a broadcast moment in the making. Karoline looked down at the last email she held. Her voice softened, almost intimate, but it echoed like thunder. It ends with this: "She's young, but not naive. Do not underestimate her again." She looked up, eyes locked on Warren. "You already did. And here I am." The tension in the chamber had reached a palpable pitch. A silence so tight you could hear the soft tap of Karoline's page as she laid the email on the table with deliberate precision. She wasn't grandstanding. She wasn't shouting. And that made her all the more dangerous. Her authority didn't come from volume. It came from clarity, from truth, from the unrelenting conviction in her voice. Elizabeth Warren's aide leaned toward her, whispering frantically, perhaps suggesting an adjournment, perhaps damage control. But Warren didn't respond. She was staring ahead, the practiced mask of political control beginning to crack just slightly at the edge. Her jaw tightened, but she knew what everyone else in the room already knew. It was too late. Karoline leaned forward now, her hands flat on the table. "You've spoken about fighting for women who don't have a voice. But when one speaks and disagrees with your platform, your team calls her a liability to the narrative." That was the wording in the internal memo, wasn't it? She pulled another sheet from her folder. This one was a printout of calendar entries and internal notes. "You tried to cancel interviews I was scheduled for. You called donors who supported both of us and told them I was, quote, a threat to unity. But let me ask this, unity for whom?" That question wasn't rhetorical. It rang across the room like a gavel strike. Behind Karoline, some of the younger staffers, likely interns, unpaid aides, political science majors who once idolized Warren, were exchanging wide-eyed glances. The foundation of what they thought was authentic advocacy was crumbling. Warren opened her mouth to interject, but Karoline raised a single hand, not in arrogance, but in poise. "You'll have your time," she said, with a tone so cool it bordered on surgical. And then, with a suddenness that felt like a cinematic beat, she did something no one expected. She stood up. With both hands, she gathered the printed emails, held them chest high, and slowly walked to the front of the room, placing them on the witness podium as if submitting them to history. "I've brought receipts," she said, "but more than that, I brought truth. And I'm done letting that be silence behind closed doors." A beat passed, and then applause from the gallery. Quiet at first, like hesitant rain on a rooftop, but then louder, real. People stood. Some didn't. But the moment was owned, and it was hers. The standing ovation wasn't in the plan, not in Karoline's, certainly not in Warren's. It grew organically, an uncontrollable reaction to truth spoken plainly in a room built for obfuscation. But Karoline didn't smile. Not yet. She didn't revel. She simply stood still at the podium, letting the moment breathe. Warren looked shaken, but not defeated, not outwardly. She'd survived hearings, floor fights, and Sunday shows with tougher questions. But this was different. This wasn't a journalist trying to corner her or a rival senator filibustering. This was a young woman she'd once dismissed, now commanding the room with nothing but emails and backbone. Karoline finally spoke again, quieter this time. "This isn't about me versus you. It's not even about these emails." She held one up gently. "It's about a culture in this town, one that lifts women until they start thinking for themselves. Then it finds ways to clip their wings." The line landed hard. It was more than political. It was generational. It was a rebuke not just of Warren, but of an establishment that had promised change only to gatekeep it. Warren stood now, slowly, Her hands trembled just slightly as she reached for her microphone. "Ms. Leavitt, if you believe I tried to silence you, then let me be clear. I do not apologize for protecting a movement from internal division." Karoline raised her eyes. "And I don't apologize for refusing to be part of a movement that only empowers women who agree with you." That was the final blow. Not shouted, not weaponized, but spoken like a fact already proven. The gallery didn't cheer this time. They absorbed it, like a verdict they couldn't unhear. The committee chair tapped his gavel. "We'll return to order." But there was no true order left to return to. The structure had cracked. The performance was over. Karoline sat back down, but she didn't look down. She looked straight ahead, composed, steady, like someone who knew this wasn't just a moment. It was a marker. Across the internet, the clips had already begun to circulate. One headline read, "Karoline Leavitt brings down the room," with Warren's own words. Another simply said, "She read." They listened. But Karoline didn't check Twitter. She didn't need to. She had walked into that room with only her voice and their words. And that had been enough. The hearing adjourned, but no one truly left. Not mentally, not emotionally. Staffers shuffled in stunned silence. Journalists sprinted toward stairwells to upload their clips before anyone else. And Elizabeth Warren, usually composed and collected, exited the chamber with the weight of something unspoken pressing on her shoulders. Karoline stayed. She didn't move from her seat. Not right away. Her fingertips rested on the last page she'd read, as though grounding herself in the very truth that had shaken the foundations of that room. A young aide approached her, barely older than a college freshman, and whispered, "I didn't know all this." "I believe them." Karoline turned, not with condescension, but with calm clarity. "Now you know, and next time, speak up sooner." Outside, cameras had gathered. They expected her to gloat, to declare victory, to throw soundbites like darts. Instead, Karoline stepped into the sunlight with a silence that demanded more attention than any speech. She faced the crowd of reporters and simply said, "You heard the words. You read the emails. I didn't come here to burn bridges. I came here to show what's on them." And then she walked. No entourage, no script, no theatrics. Just a woman who had refused to be a footnote in someone else's narrative. That night, the footage went viral. Not just in political corners of the internet, but among young women in law schools, debate teams, and grassroots campaigns. Karoline's calm defiance, her precision, her refusal to be reshaped into someone more acceptable. It resonated. It inspired. Meanwhile, Warren's team issued a carefully worded statement attempting to clarify the emails. But the damage was done, not just to her image, but to the illusion that control of the narrative still belonged to the old guard. In a podcast the following week, a political analyst summed it up perfectly. Elizabeth Warren tried to bury her. But Karoline didn't fight back with fury. She fought with facts. And that made her unstoppable. Months later, when Karoline was asked in another interview what she had felt that day, she answered with the same quiet strength that had defined her testimony. "I wasn't angry. I was ready. And then came the moment they never saw coming. They told her she'd never make it. That there was no path. That it wasn't her time." But Karoline didn't just memorize what they said. She read it. Not behind closed doors, not in whispers. She read it out loud. In front of the nation. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait her turn. Because when the gatekeepers tried to lock her out, she didn't knock. She brought the receipts. She told the truth. And she turned their silence into a microphone. This wasn't just her story. It was a message to every young woman who's ever been underestimated. You don't need their approval, just your voice. And Karoline? She used hers, so the rest of us wouldn't have to whisper anymore.